What a blast from the past this is. Oh my gosh, it's so great to see familiar faces, folks I've just met in the last few months like Janie, and then folks that I've known for a long time. Tommy Greathouse Jr., I recall was in our JYF group. That's the first time we ever had a JYF group, 4th and 5th graders, had about 15 of them. And to this day, it was the loudest decibels I have ever been a part of in anything. And Tommy was the most enthusiastic out of the whole bunch, I think. Great bunch, great memories. It's so good to see you all. I have to say to you, with your birthdays and anniversaries here, my first wife, Julie, and I celebrated our 55th wedding anniversary just a couple of days ago. We think now that we're up to speed at 55. So from here it should be on cruise control, we're hoping. It's really wonderful to be back and to be a part of this church that just stepping into this place gives me so much of a burst of God's Spirit that I feel like by the time I've walked up here to this pulpit, that I'm ready to hang it up for the day. You know, I feel like I've already had a heart full of Christ, and your presence here just makes that even more so. So thank you all for coming out and being a part of this spirit stirring and of the memory making in my life. Thank you all so much. We're going to share today from Philippians, the 4th chapter of Philippians, start with the first verse. It's an odd little arrangement in the Bible because the first verse really just tags on to the last sentence of the last chapter's last verse, if that makes any sense to you. Paul's writings are always creative, and we have to remember, Fred Craddock says, when we read Philippians as one of the books of the Bible, what we're doing is we're really reading somebody else's mail. You know, these are Paul's words to this church that he started in Philippi, and he is trying to talk to them and encourage them because if you think that taking care of old churches is a problem, you ought to try starting a new religion in the midst of an area that was not Christian in any sense of the word. And so Paul writes this to the church at Philippi, and he makes use of this common references to the folks in the church. He says this: "Therefore, my brothers and sisters, whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, stand firm in the Lord in this way, my beloved. I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask also, my loyal companion, help these women, for they have struggled beside me in the work of the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are in the book of life. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. Do not worry about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your request be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
I was looking forward to come back and saying hello to L.L. Pinkerton up there. I realized when I was sitting here a minute ago that when I was here, started at this church when I was 20 years old, and I would look up there and the picture, and Pinkerton looked really old to me. And I was sitting here remarking to myself at how young he looks now. I didn't think that stained glass windows would change like that. I'm a movie buff. I always have been. And one of the types of movies I loved, and I know, they were terrible movies. I know that. But oh, how I loved them. And that was when they would take these two legendary anti-heroes and pit them against each other. And you would have these movies that were called, Godzilla versus King Kong, or Godzilla versus Mothra, or Dracula versus the Wolfman, or Alien versus Predator. You've seen all those, haven't you? Right? No, I may be the only one, but I sure did love that. They were pure, mindless entertainment. They were just simply fun. But you know that little word in between all of those names, that versus? That is the worst word in the world for ministry. Versus. The title of the sermon today looks like one of those matchups between two little-known Ivy League schools that these people love to report on Sports Center. You know, Slippery Rock versus Bellwood. Well, today we've got Euodia versus Syntyche. But as we look at this text today, even though we're reading somebody else's mail, and even though the writer of this letter and the recipients of the letter would know who Euodia was and would know who Syntyche was, and they would know who Clement was, to which Paul refers in this, and they would even know the identity of the loyal companion that Paul mentions in this. But we don't know anything about that. In these days, we have no knowledge of that because none of those people are ever mentioned in the Bible again. This is the only place. And so we probably don't get a lot of Bible stories about these characters because the stories just simply aren't there. Euodia and Syntyche. But you know, the lesson that we learned from their dispute has hung with us today and will provide us today with inspiration for how we do ministry in the church and through the church, in our lives and through our lives. The one thing that we do know is that they were women who were members and leaders in the church that Paul started at Philippi, and they were in some kind of a dispute, either against the church, the two of them against the church, or the two of them against each other. And I think from the sentence structure of the scripture that it's most likely given that they were having some kind of a problem with each other. And you know, some people in our society might read this and say, aha, two women having a problem with each other. This is just a proof text then for not allowing women in church leadership. But that's obviously not Paul's belief here. And it's certainly not ours in the Christian church, disciples of Christ. We are smart enough to value people and to value women. I heard the story that 5 people were being rescued in the mountains, 4 men and 1 woman, and the rescue helicopter could only make one pass, so all 5 of them were hanging onto the rope of the rescue helicopter. Well, the problem was that was too much weight, and so the rope was beginning to fray. The 5 that were there were 4 men and 1 woman. And they were all saying to the other, you need to let go. You need to let go so the rest of us will be saved. And they knew that one person would have to do that, but they couldn't decide who it was going to be as they clung to this breaking rope. So the one woman gave this touching speech, saying how she would let go, and she would give up her life to save theirs. Because women are used to giving up things for their husbands and their children, used to giving in to men. And that after all, men were the superior gender and must be saved. And when she finished speaking, all the men who had been clinging to this rope were so touched, they all began to applaud. Never underestimate the wisdom of a woman. Commentary writer Matthew Henry, writing about this particular verse way back in the 1700s, condescendingly says, women may be helpful to ministers in the work of the gospel. Yes, Matthew, and so might men, you know. So see this mention in Philippians not as a negative because two women were quarreling, but as a positive because two women were leaders in this church in Philippi, associates of Paul the Apostle, co-workers whose names are in the book of life, ministers who struggled right by Paul's side for the sake of the gospel. And the lesson gifted to us by this little personal note in Paul's letter is that leaders have the capacity to build, but also to destroy, to bring together, but also to rip apart, to heal, but also to sicken. So hear this message, ministers of the Christian church. And oh, by the way, in our tradition, Christian Church Disciples of Christ, we are all ministers, all of us. So this one's for you. We don't know what this dispute was all about, but because of it, Paul gives us some hints at producing an effective ministry that would solve any dispute in the church. Paul says, first of all, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say, rejoice. Now, we ministers, those behind pulpits and those of you out in the pews, we need to rejoice, not react to things, right? We need to enjoy, not to enjoin or admonish each other. It's always amazed me to see the number of folks who would wash up upon the shores of a Christian church as refugees from some other church situation in which they had just felt pounded on the head. And they come to us wounded and weary and just wanting to sit and worship and heal, afraid to participate, unable to participate until that fear subsides a little bit within them, the fear that always waits for that other shoe to fall, you know. The compassionate, cooperative spirit of disciples of Christ members and the healing spirit of Jesus the Christ help keep the struggles in most of our congregations relatively minor. And it's our job to keep it that way, to provide this safe haven for battered Christians. And how do we do that? Rejoice, Paul says. Rejoice! You know, by looking at some of our churches on any given Sunday morning, you might think that they were named the Holy Church of the Perpetual Frown. Been in those churches, have you? I have. I know one time we were having a community sunrise service up at the college, and it snowed, and we couldn't use the amphitheater, and so we were inside the auditorium up at Midway College, and there were only about 30 people there in that big auditorium, and the voices would echo off the walls, and the young minister from the Second Christian Church was preaching that day, and he stood up there and was giving a wonderful sermon, and everybody was listening very politely and very quietly to him, and he stopped in the middle of his sermon. He said, "You know what?" He said, "You can make as much noise as you want to out there, but this silence is killing me." Well, it's true. You know, we see it as religion is to be a somber, serious business. Too many of us see it that way, and too much, I think. Well, it is serious business. It's too serious to go about without rejoicing. So think of the church not as a pot of boiling problems to be solved, but as a potpourri of delightful aromas that can lift one's spirit and add fragrance to one's life. Leaders are created to bring out the joy of the church, not to bring out the artillery. Secondly, hear Paul say, let your gentleness be known to everyone. You know, that's a word that's not in vogue in these days. People don't get claps on the back for being gentle. They get claps on the back and praise for being harsh and cruel and mean as they can be to each other. But Paul says, no, let your gentleness be known to everyone. An elder in a church that I served, and it wasn't this one, told me that his job on the church board was to be the watchdog of the church. He kept a critical eye focused on every discussion, every leader, and he gleefully pointed out their every mistake and every flaw. Well, you know what? That wasn't much of a challenge for his life's work, was it? After all, in a church, things are going to go wrong. They're going to go wrong in a church. Needed programs are going to be missing. Members and ministers are going to mess up or disappoint you. And it's no great task to find these errors. I mean, they're all over the place. And why is that? Because the church is full of humans. That's why. I mean, take away all the humans, fill a church with angels, and then let that elder decide to be the watchdog. Now, that's a calling. That would be a calling. But the church on earth, finding fault within it, it's like trying to find a blackbird in a shade tree on a summer evening. You throw a stick in there and you can't help but hit 10 or 12 of them. Well, instead of criticism, Paul urges us to gentleness. Better than a watchdog, be a lapdog. Now that may have some negative connotations in your mind. You know, the lapdog is the one who's meek and just lets everybody walk all over him or her. Well, no, not really. Not really. As the one who had Earth's sweetest lapdog for 14 years, Pepper the dachshund, I'll tell you, there's nothing to take the place of it. I mean, you come in from a day at work, a day which has worn most of the humanity off of your soul, a day in which your spirit has been dashed on the jagged rocks of incrimination and hostility, a day that's left you empty, echoing like an abandoned house. And you toss your things aside and you flop down into a chair, and that measly little dog runs to you, leaps up beside you, snuggles against you in pure, unconditional love, and drains all of your woes from you, leaving peace in their place. That is our role as ministers to one another. That's our role. That's our goal as a church, to bring gentleness into our world, into our lives. Thirdly, Paul says, do not worry about anything. Did you hear that? Sounds like that great song from several years ago. Here's a little song I wrote. You got to sing it note by note. Don't worry. Be happy. Yeah? Too simplistic for you? But you know, there's so much truth in that little song. If you had to choose a role, which would you rather be? A doomsayer or a calming presence? Which would you rather be? Now let me ask you, which one had you rather have a church full of? The doomsayers or calming presences? You know the doomsayer, sure you know him because we all have a little bit of him in us, don't we? When he rises up in us, we want to make things worse. I mean, we really do. We want to make them worse than they are. We exaggerate the problems. We apply the dramatic to life. We pass along gossip, outwardly alibying that, oh, it's just something you ought to know. Yet inwardly having that scoop, enjoying having the scoop on somebody. The doomsayer expects the worst of every situation. You know, I'd read one time when I was the minister here about a church in Chicago that had a specific rule for their general board, and I tried to bring it in here. And I don't know how well it caught on one way or another here, but at least it was good for a while for us. And the rule, the policy was that no board members were allowed to make any negative comments about a suggestion until 3 positive comments had been made. I thought it was a good rule, and I think we did do well with it for a while. Now, on the other hand, when I left here, I served a church that had its best year in history. Best year. The highest worship attendance ever, the most additions, the highest budget, the highest giving, the largest youth group, the most activities ever. And the trustees of that church that were known as the Doomsday Dozen, they responded to that record-breaking achievement by freezing all staff salaries for the next year because they said, and I quote, "This might be the year that the church roof starts leaking." Paul would tell us, don't worry, be happy. And yet that little prophet of doom down inside us says to us, well, this good can't continue, right? Don't worry, be happy. Be the calming presence when problems arise. Be the reassurer when turbulence is encountered. Be the one who keeps perspective and doesn't elevate bumps into barriers. Be the one who lifts our sights. Hiking Rough Trail. Any of y'all hiked Rough Trail in Red River Gorge? It's a great trail. Pay attention to the name of it if you decide to go there. Hiking Rough Trail in Red River Gorge after a rainfall, my hiking partner Glenn and I came to a segment of the trail that, honest to goodness, went straight up the side of a steep peak. I mean, just almost straight up. And in dry weather, that climb would have made your calves ache as you struggle to put one foot in front of the other. But with the wet autumn leaves underfoot, it was worse. You would step forward 12 inches, legs aching, breathing hard, and yet when you step forward 12 inches, your feet on those wet leaves would slide back 8. You would have gained 4 inches on that. So the day that he and I hiked, my legs were killing me. I didn't think I was going to be able to get another breath. I was heaving and wheezing so hard. My eyes were glued to that shifting rock and shifting humus on the ground below my feet. I was clinging to a tree root, trying to pull myself up this thing, and I decided that it was just time to give up on this particular hillside and to just turn back. And then Glenn told me to look up. And so I did, to the multicolored foliage up on the ridgetop, and the baby blue fall sky above that with wisps of white clouds floating by. Suddenly, I wasn't climbing for the top of a soggy mountain. I was climbing for the clouds. Makes a difference. Glenn would have made a good minister. A calming presence who lifts our sights above where we currently are and brings us to understand what the heights are in our life. And you know, lifting people's presence to greater things, that's our role as ministers. That's what we're supposed to be doing with our lives. Ministers, you and I, have the capacity to build or to destroy. And you see, ministry is not just about talent. It's more about heart. And Paul knew that. I bet Euodia and Syntyche knew that too. And thanks to their momentary lapse, we now know that. And we can avoid the verses because of these verses. Thanks be to God, and may God bless your individual ministries and your ministry as a church.